as all of us in this room are aware, the sort of climate change era and the broader Earth system collapse that we're talking about, sometimes called the Anthropocene, is a very disorienting time. And it's really important for us to come together and try to get our bearings. One of the things about it, and I refer here, name's just fallen out of my head, the book The Great Derangement by Amitov, talks about the way that we're very, very effective at shutting out of our minds the true character of the climate change catastrophe. And that's certainly something that a lot of us who work in climate change education really fight against. So we're always trying to actually encourage people to accept it, to engage with it, at the same time as being very, very aware of the mental health and stress implications of emphasising the negative aspects of it too much. And so it's a really fine line. So in all of that, I've gradually come to see this talk of justice and this sort of orientation, this zeitgeist, if you like, around justice and bringing together the different aspects of justice, human justice, animal rights justice, but also food justice, energy justice, as a kind of orientation device and as a kind of indication, I think, of us collectively trying to find our bearings. And so that's, in a sense, what I think we're trying to do a little bit here. We understand that the old frameworks that we've been working with, the very humanist frameworks, are no longer adequate. They're no longer adequate for many, many reasons. And so we really need a new kind of map, if you like, of how we can actually act in this weird, disorienting world. Now, when I use the term orienting and orientation, I'm very much inspired by Sarah Ahmed, who you may be familiar with. And in her book, Queer Phenomenology, she talks about orientation as a way of understanding how we are in the world, of how we're being in the world. And she talks a lot about objects, but I think what she talks about is very much relevant to thinking about this thing of how we are in the world with other species, with these other species that we put in this big category, non-humans, otherwise nature. And as she says, what does it mean to be orientated? It means to be turned towards, we could say, certain beings, those that help us find our way. That's what I think we can do here. These are beings that we recognise so that when we face them, we know which way are we facing. So I think there's something very helpful here if we think about cultural recognition as one of the key elements of justice. We're thinking here about how we recognise other beings and looking to them to help us orient ourselves in this disorienting, deranging time of climate change. And asking what difference does it make how we're orienting towards them. Now what I want to talk about is a little bit around how we're naturally starting to do this or automatically starting to do this because of climate change and climate change impacts and adaptation. And I think we're doing it in an unreflexive way and need to start being a little bit more careful. Now, of course, the general human orientation to the rest of the world, to all other species, has evolved rapidly, but it pretty much comes back to this kind of hierarchical structure again and again in all sorts of different guises. And this is, of course, the one where humans are kind of the most superior species because of their apparent proximity to the heavens, to God, and below that you have a series usually related to similarities to humans of decreasing worth or decreasing value. And this is referred to sometimes as the ladder of the intellect. So how similar are things to us, and that has been clearly reconstructed and deconstructed, but nevertheless is an extremely resilient framing when we think of the common sense attitude to humans. And it's one that's being reinforced, I suggest, in some of our climate change adaptations. So just to kind of finish off on the sort of broader introduction, what I sort of am getting at here is the way that climate change is messing with our world, but at the same time we have these cultural resources, we have that hierarchy of being, that great chain of being, which is also being reinforced. We're using that as an orientation. And certainly in the climate justice movement, the humanist notion of human worth and the worth of human lives is a very strong and, we should say, important framing to orient us towards understanding the ethical implications of climate change. But nevertheless, we're also getting challenged to rethink this. And there's two kind of ways in which this is happening. One is the way that the world is physically changing, the material changes that climate change is bringing about. So some things are becoming more abundant, some things are changing in character. When I say things, I'm talking here about other species as well. And interrelated with that is we're actually altering how we value things. We're altering what we think of them, what their engagement or position is relative to us humans as a species. So let me look at this in more detail. So one of the other orientations besides the humanist great chain of being is what Rosemary Claire Collard and Jess Dempsey talk about as this kind of idea of seeing like a capitalist. So not only do we have a kind of ancient idea of a very strong linear hierarchy, we also have a much more fine-grained analysis of other species. And this is something that they talk about in terms of different orientations, again, drawing on Sarah Ahmed's work. They talk about 5 different categories by which we tend to classify not just non-humans, but also humans. And this is the sort of capitalist kind of map of the world, if you like. And you can see there at the top, we have the officially valued, those that have a direct monetary value in a capitalist system. And generally speaking, that's why we're pushing all university students out to become employed. That's the sort of university side of success is employment, and that's very, very strong in the neoliberal higher education sector in Australia. So that idea of employment as being a characteristic of a valued human. Of course, there's non-human elements of that, and that tends to be the non-humans that have a dollar value on their head, and livestock is a very clear example of that. Then you've got what they call the reserve army, those who are not at the moment directly earning money, not directly contributing to economic growth, but they could. And this again, it's the students, it's their children, the kind of potential workforce that we're all kind of being asked to contribute to. And I should just say as an aside, I've got a PhD student from Iran looking at women's health and women's reproduction, and it's just very, very explicit there about women's role in actually producing a future workforce. And arguably we have a similar sort of attitude in Australia, just less written down on paper. So there's that, and then from the non-human perspective, you've actually got that whole idea of genes, genetic resources, and also resources that are out there that haven't yet been harvested but are there for the taking in the future. And Australia's attitude towards coal is very much of this character, not another species, but that whole idea, well, we don't want to waste it, it's there in the ground, what would we do, just leave it there? Precisely right, we would. Then you've got what they call the underground, and these are the ones that actually do that unpaid work, that are involved in social reproduction. Increasingly, we're trying to put a dollar value on that, but nevertheless, so much of it remains unvalued. And again, there's an attempt to put a dollar value on that when it comes to ecosystem services. There's sort of a recognition of moving the underground into the officially valued. Then you've got the outcast surplus, who are pretty much sort of just worthless, useless. So they're permanently unemployed, unemployable, that idea of they're not contributing to the economy. In the non-human world, you've got a whole lot of examples, but some is the sort of overproduction, some is, for example, in the dairy industry, you know, it's just kind of useless producing male calves, except they do obviously get sold as veal, but nevertheless, you know, they are kind of considered within the dairy sector per se as outcast surplus. And then you've got those that are threats. These are those that may become injured and wanting compensation. These are those that are protesting. These are those who are disruptive. And you see very strong reactions against that in Australia. And of course, in the non-human world, we have a very, very strong sense of threat, and climate change is really amplifying this as well. So, as I said, I'm really interested in the way both materially and culturally climate change and our sort of unthinking reactions to that, or in some cases very deliberate reactions to that, are starting to alter these orientations and these valuations of both humans and non-humans. And one of the kind of really clear ways or clear sites or arenas in which this is happening is emergency management. Now, in emergency management, there's a couple of very strong hierarchical frameworks that guide a lot of action. So in the sort of hospital setting, so that emergency management ward, which I'm sure every person in this room has had some experience with in your life, if you're left waiting for a long time, that's a good sign, because they mean you've got pretty good prospects. Okay? If you rush through, not so great, you might think you're actually just special, which is usually because they've assessed you to think that actually you're most in trouble. But of course, if they never actually come and speak to you, it's probably because they've assessed that you're deceased. Sorry to be flippant about it, but so this is just this is a tag from a nursing thing where they, the hierarchy is deceased, move on, immediate action needed, delayed action okay, or minor. Okay? And I think most of us usually get chucked into the minor, don't you? You jump up and down. So there's a triage, and it's really basically an assessment of people's people's potential. On the other hand, in emergency management, there's also a kind of filter that determines how the call-outs are actually determined as well. And this is about rescue priorities. And where this gets most clearly articulated is in reporting about losses from emergencies. So what's the typical kind of statement you hear to give a sense of the quantum of a disaster? Yep. Deaths. Yep.
How many people have died?
How many people have died? Yep. What else do they tend to add to that?
Property.
That's right. And so usually the usual sort of statement about, like, say, I don't know, the bushfire, let's say Victorian bushfires, 364 people dead, $562 million worth of property losses, and let's say 500,000 head of livestock loss. That's the sort of summary type statement which is used to encapsulate the importance of a disaster. And it's a real indication of the way that you have this hierarchical framework overlaid with an implicit capitalist framework, that sense of what's most important. So they mention livestock not because of their relationship or proximity to humans in the great chain of being, but because of their capitalist importance. What is often not reported, of course, are wildlife losses. What is not reported is all the intangibles, the mental health work that Petra's done, of course, all of the other flow-on effects. But what's reported are these direct losses, and it's very much an insurance industry lens. So I've been doing a little bit of work on the bushfires in January and February 2016 in Tasmania. Do people remember this? One of the kind of really confronting things about these fires, when there were over 70 lightning strikes up in the mountains of Tasmania in areas that are not at all accustomed to fire, was that at the same time there were numbers of fires burning around the mainland and other parts of Tasmania. And so because this was a wilderness area, it was actually attributed fairly low priority when it came to the actual fire response, to such an extent that an inquiry was called to investigate this delayed reaction from the Fire Management Service to actually go and rescue the wilderness. And that is actually part of the whole sort of mentality that wilderness shouldn't need rescuing, that fire is a natural part of these systems, particularly in the Australian situation, and that in actual fact it doesn't even register on that insurance lens sense of loss. What happened when they actually did go in was that they found that there were actually some human structures under threat, and in one particular case they found a half-built replica pioneer hut that was under threat, and so they did what normal fire service does, which is to backburn the vegetation around it in order to protect it. Now the vegetation, that fuel that they backburned, so the fuel was a threat, So that because of the proximity to the hut, the surrounding trees were cast as a threat. Because of that actual vegetation was actually king billy pines, and some of them were 1,000 years old. Now, you probably can't blame the 22-year-olds or whatever who were, helicoptered in a stressful situation for not assessing the botanical worth of those particular individuals. But it encapsulates the way in which our humanist frameworks and these existing frameworks are being enacted in a climate change world in a way that just doesn't make sense. That was brought in one of the submissions to the inquiry because of a lack of evidence. It was considered to be anecdotal, but nevertheless, it is an indication whether or not the fire service actually accepts it. It is an indication of the complications that climate change is bringing. And this is just a quote about the sort of losses we're talking about. It's about Gondwana vegetation. This is vegetation from a very, very long time ago. The other challenge to actually getting people to appreciate that sort of loss in this fire situation was because the trees are so old, because this is part of a Gondwana relic, there is a sense that actually it's already on the way out. It's some kind of uncanny presence from the past. It's sort of here, but sort of not here. Sort of half there, it's materially there, but sort of imagined. And so what I'm trying to work towards here is that I think what we're seeing is that with climate change, adaptation responses, and I've used emergency management as the example here, we're starting to see a capitalist-oriented reproduction of a new sort of sorting and categorisation of different non-humans. And of course, there's a very, very strong relationship here with some very resilient ways in which we have framed humans as well. So just quickly to finish up. So you've got the officially valued, and all of us are told that we really need to be resilient. And resilient employees at RMIT are particularly valued within resilience training. So that's part of it. And hardy species, we're all looking now around in our gardens to find the species that take the least work. It's a real reorientation of sort of what the good garden looks like in these drought times. Then you've got those who are considered newly useful. So in the non-human case, we've got all sorts of things coming into play. So seaweed, Tim Flannery's, we're excited about seaweed. And that's because you can feed seaweed to cows, and cows have been newly cast as a threat because it suddenly realised that the methane they're burping is one of the contributors to climate change. In terms of newly useful, it's hard to say, but there's a whole lot of new skills that are being required as well. Just to really, it's the last two I want to focus on here, the outcast surplus. So we have this sense in which species that are old, species that are in wilderness, species that have proven to be vulnerable to climate change, are in a sense falling down that triage framework. They're falling off, they're actually getting too far gone. And so there's this idea that they're sort of dying out. And of course that's very much the language and the narrative that's being directed at Indigenous peoples in all sorts of places, but particularly Australia, that sense that they're naturally dying out. Then we also have this new idea of threat. And again, we've got new ideas of invasives and pathogens, and also climate itself. And of course, this is the attitude that's being directed towards those who were fearful are going to come and invade Australia. So the point is that we actually have a kind of reorientation going on. So coming back to this point, given this situation in which climate change impacts and adaptation are reorienting how we're categorising in our minds the different attributes of different non-humans and humans, how can we actually somehow find and reorient ourselves to other species in a way that allows us to find the justice bearings that we need? And one element here that we might want to think about is the way we're actually entangled and move towards more of what Haraway talks about as the kind of entanglement and care ethic, as opposed to these kind of categorisations which are being fostered in under the name of emergency management and other climate change adaptations.